So we're at Palm Springs today in sunny Southern California, although it's not looking very sunny at the moment, and I'm going to talk about ice today. Now you might think Palm Springs is an unlikely setting in which to talk about ice, but it's pretty cold today. We're just above freezing, it's raining, and don't forget that as soon as we take off, that temperature is going to drop off as we climb, so it's about 2 degrees drop off per 1,000 feet. Now ice is a real problem for aircraft, particularly when flying IFR, so we're going to look at some of the problems we can encounter, to what extent those are simulated in the Twin Otter, and what we can do to combat those effects. So let's just have a quick run through of what icing can do to an aircraft and to what extent those things are simulated in FSX. The thing most people will be aware of, particularly flying piston engined aircraft, is carburetor icing. Now carburetor icing is the icing of the intake to the carburetor, and in fact that can happen when the temperature is well above freezing, because the carburetor itself, by its nature, it has a cryogenic or a refrigerating effect on the incoming airflow. So carburetor icing, now we don't have carburetors in this aircraft, but we do have air intakes, and we have some of the similar issues. You know, the air is restricted as it's diverted through the intake, so we've got to think about intake icing. Another thing you get fairly commonly is, and the first sign of icing in an aircraft usually, is the pitot tube will block, and so the airspeed indicator will stop working. Now in FSX that stops fairly abruptly. You just see the airspeed indicator fall to zero. Another effect of icing is build-up of ice on the propeller blades, and this too is modelled in FSX. Over time there's an accumulation of ice on the prop blades, and this reduces the efficiency of the propeller. Now if you remember back to all that complicated stuff about the propeller angle of attack and the RPM, as you accumulate ice on the propeller blades, the efficiency of the prop changes, and that delicate balance of the RPM and the angle of attack is upset. So the net effect of that is, over time you get I suppose an increase in the fuel burn is what you'd notice. So that's simulated in FSX as well. Beyond that, we need to look at structural icing, and that's the build-up of ice on the wing and tail surfaces. Now the problem with this is it is modelled in FSX. Well, there's two problems with this. The first problem is there's no visible sign of that happening. So you know, in a real aircraft you'd look out at the wings and you'd see fairly obvious signs that ice was accumulating. We don't have that in FSX. The other problem with the build-up of structural ice in FSX, there's a general consensus that the modelling of structural ice accumulation in FSX is fairly weak, in the sense that it's quite rare to encounter it, and when you do encounter it the build-up is fairly slow. But it does happen, and over time the effects of this that you will notice are, obviously the weight of the aircraft will increase significantly, and you know, eventually critically. Essentially you're going to be overloading the aircraft as if you know, shoved in a bunch of extra cargo, and that will affect the flight characteristics. The other effects of ice accumulation in real life are twofold. You get significant increase in the drag, which is modelled to some extent in FSX, and also of course it changes the profile of the wings and tail surfaces, and that can upset the aerodynamic properties. The wing will fly less efficiently, the angle of attack to the relative wind changes, and so on. So again, all of this is modelled to some degree in FSX, but it's rare and it's subtle. So to understand a little bit about why these effects are so subtle in FSX and so elusive, you might say, we need to say a little bit about the conditions under which icing will occur. Now you need two things for ice to form. You need low temperature and you need moisture. So in the real world, flying through clouds or through rain when the temperature is within a sufficiently low range, you know, you're more or less guaranteed to get ice. In FSX how it works is it follows the weather. Whichever scheme you're using to control the weather, it will have a big impact on whether or not you encounter icing and how frequently and how severe. Essentially FSX produces icing conditions when you have a cloud layer that has an icing attribute set. Now there's also a severity. If you look in the weather dialogues, if you set icing for a particular cloud layer, you have, I think it's light, moderate and severe icing. So if you're flying in a cloud layer that has one of the icing attributes set and the temperature is below zero, you're going to start to get ice accumulating in the manner that I've described. So if you're using something, let's say like active sky, to manage real world weather, it's going to depend crucially on how effectively active sky associates those icing flags with the cloud layers it produces. Now at the moment we're still talking about basic default FSX modelling of the icing structures, and the last thing to say about that is the FSX SDK does provide a bunch of de-icing and anti-icing tools that can be incorporated into the aircraft models, and these are implemented to some extent in some of the default aircraft. Now you probably know about the carburetor heat control, which is actually a more generic control. Under the skin it's called engine anti-ice, and there's one for each engine independently. You probably know there's a pitot heat control to warm up the pitot tube and prevent icing. Beyond that you've got various de-icing controls, and usually these operate things called de-icing boots, which are on the control surfaces, that are on the wing and sometimes the tail surfaces, and these will expand and break the ice off. So we're fairly well provided for in FSX for baseline ice formation and measures we can take to deal with the ice. But what about the Twin Otter? Well, one of the things the Twin Otter does, if you read the Aerosoft documents, it acknowledges that the inbuilt icing features in the manner we've described are fairly elusive and subtle. So what Aerosoft has done is, in the Twin Otter Extended, it's implemented its own model of ice accumulation that sits alongside FSX's model. Now it's an additive model in the sense that the Twin Otter will accumulate ice if it encounters a cloud layer with one of the icing attributes set if the temperature is sufficiently low. But what they've also done is they've put in some extra rules that allow the formation of ice under other conditions. For example, under conditions such as what you see behind me, if we were flying through rain and the temperature was sufficiently low, but even if there was no icing attributes set on the particular cloud layer we were in, the Twin Otter Extended would accumulate ice as well. In fact, if it's flying through rain or snow and the temperature's, I think, between -11 degrees and +1 degrees, will begin to accumulate ice. However, if we're not flying through rain, but we are flying through a cloud layer that has the icing attribute set, it will still accumulate ice in the manner of default FSX behaviour. I hope that makes sense. And the net effect of this is that we're much more likely to encounter ice formation in the Twin Otter than we would be in a default FSX aircraft, and indeed it's quite likely that when we do encounter icing conditions, the ice will accumulate faster. So let's have a look at that in action. We're going to go for a ride. We're going to try and get a sense of what the icing accumulation does to the aircraft, and then we'll think about what we can do to combat it. Okay, what do we need? Flaps are set, everything. Now I've left everything off. We're going to talk about anti-icing measures as we go, but for now let's just get up in the air. Going to go straight onto autopilot, let it take over and just keep us on this heading. So what do we need to be looking at? Well, clearly we've got rain going on out there. What you can't see is that we are in a cloud layer that has the icing attribute set, because I've set that up deliberately for us. We need to check the outside air temperature, which is still just above 0. So that should be falling off in the next sort of half a minute or so. And so we should be into icing conditions by now. We ought to be looking out for the signs of icing on the aircraft. Now the first thing we are going to notice, we've noticed already, if you look at the airspeed indicators drop to 0. I wasn't watching when it did that, but that's obviously due to pitot tube icing. If I center that up, what I'll do is take the first of the anti-ice measures that we're equipped with in the Twin Otter. That is pitot heat on. So if we just keep an eye on that, in the next couple of seconds that airspeed indicator should come back alive. There it goes. So that's fairly undramatic, and you know, the way that fails and unfails is not terribly realistic, but it is modelled. The next thing we're going to notice is something that's not a default FSX feature. It's something that's unique to, well, not unique to, but it is modelled specifically in the Aerosoft Twin Otter Extended, and that is we're going to see ice start to accumulate on the windshield, and if we don't do anything about it, we're going to basically eventually not be able to see anything out of the forward windshield. We don't get icing on the side windows. So if I let that build up for a little while, in fact you can just see the first sign, because we're looking at a cloud there, it's difficult to see, but you can see it around the margins initially. 5,300 feet. You'll notice it's no longer raining outside. We've risen above that cloud layer, but we're still in a cloud layer that has icing set. Again, because I've set this up deliberately beforehand. If I set us to level off here at 5,500 feet, I'll just press altitude hold. And if I just turn us around, so now we've got a definite accumulation of ice on the windshield, kind of around the edges there. I'm going to let that build up just a little bit more so it's more obvious. I want to try and turn us away from this cloud so that you can see it better. You can see it's fairly obvious now. Now, what other signs do we have of icing? Well, nothing visual beyond what we've already seen. The only way we can keep track of icing is to bring up the Twin Otter Extended checklist page, which has a configuration page that I've got it just positioned slightly off the screen there so it doesn't take up too much space. We've got the torque gauges there and the limits are visible, but we've got an icing build-up gauge here as well. So we're currently on just approaching 12% of maximum possible structural icing, and no obvious untoward effects on the handling of the aircraft so far. If I just take that away for a while, you can see the windscreen now is, you know, pretty close to opaque. So what I'm going to do is switch on the windshield de-icing. In fact, before I do that, I'm just going to try the, you know, what you might expect is that putting the windscreen wipers on would have some effect, but actually that, you know, the windshield wipers in the Twin Otter, they're just a special effect. They actually don't have any effect at all. Park those. You know, the windshield wipers, to be effective, would rely on the aircraft virtual cockpit having some model of the windshield and how it interacts with precipitation, and that's not implemented. I don't know any FSX aircraft that's implemented in, and so the windshield wipers, you know, they don't do anything other than give us a nice little special effect. So we can't see out the forward window pretty much at all now. So what I'll do is I'll switch on the next anti-icing or de-icing measure that we have, and that's the windshield heat. And we just need to wait a while. Hopefully there's nothing we're about to bump into. But as we go, you can see we can still see out the side windows. No problem with that. And there we go. We're getting a stepwise removal of that ice build-up from the forward view. And if we just monitor that icing gauge again, we're at 18%, just shy of 18% icing. And again, we're not having any obvious impact on how the aircraft handles. What we're going to notice over time, and quite subtly building up, is that the drag's going to increase, the weight's going to increase, and so we're going to find it harder to stay aloft. I guess what would be a better test would be to start off with the aircraft fully loaded. This aircraft's pretty light. I've got no cargo. I've got the default configuration, which is I think close to full fuel and just a little bit of cargo on board. The other thing we're not going to be able to see at all in the Twin Otter Extended is the effects of propeller icing. Now that's happening. We don't know it's happening because there's no way to look for it in the cockpit. There's no obvious effect. I guess in real life we may start to get some asymmetry on the propeller. We get some vibration. That's not modelled, so we don't have any indication. The only indication we get is over time, if we were looking very carefully at the fuel burn and perhaps the speed gauge, we see some difference, but it's subtle. Now I should make a distinction here as well between de-icing and anti-icing. What we just did there with the windshield, that was, you might consider that a de-icing measure. We had ice, we did something, and the ice was removed, it was melted, taken away. Likewise, at the moment we've got structural ice is accumulating. When we look at what we can do to fix that later, we're going to basically look at how we can shed that ice from the aircraft. So that's a de-icing measure as opposed to an anti-icing measure. Anti-ice would be doing something up front that's going to stop the formation of ice in the first place. Now you might regard the pitot heat control as an anti-ice measure. I guess windshield heat, if you put that on at the start, that would be an anti-ice measure. Prop de-ice, which I'll switch on now to no obvious effect. Usually that's if you know you're going to be potentially flying in icing conditions, you put that on from the word go, and basically it heats up the propeller and it prevents the formation of ice in the first place. So I'm just turning us back towards Palm Springs. We're on altitude hold, we're at 5,600 feet, we're still in icing conditions. The ice is still increasing. I've increased the size of this gauge so you can see we're just coming up to like 34.5%, towards 35% ice, structural ice buildup. If we look at the airspeed indicator, we're making just under 155 knots, 154 let's say. So we're just going to leave it there and we're going to let some time go by, let the ice build up, do nothing else to make any changes, and we'll see what happens. So just checking in, we're still on course, still 5,600 feet, just passing 70% on the structural icing gauge. And if we have a look at the speed, we've dropped now to, we're on probably 142 knots, low to the ground as well. Actually we should have been cruising at a little bit higher than this. We're just scraping over those mountains. So we'll keep going, and we're going to just see what happens as we approach maximum icing. Okay, we're back again. This time icing's at we're approaching maximum 93.5%, and you should notice that the speed's dropped significantly now. We're on 132 knots or something. So you can see we're getting I suppose we must presume that's a combined effect of the increase in weight and the increase in drag. We're on autopilot, it's holding altitude. If we're getting heavier, maybe needing to adjust the trim to compensate for that. But whatever, we're seeing those effects of the ice accumulation on the airframe, 96%. We're seeing those effects build up cumulatively, and they're subtle effects. They're not immediately apparent in the handling of the aircraft. If I come off autopilot, so just to reiterate, we're on close to maximum structural icing at the moment. You know, we've still got good aileron control, rudder's still working, elevators. I mean, it's clear that with 100% structural icing, we're not approaching the limits of the aircraft at the current load. So what might be better, if you're going to do your own experiments of this nature, you might want to start off with the 100 series, which has the lower powered engines, and then make sure you're fully loaded before you take off. Then with a full 100% structural ice load, you may be approaching the limits of the aircraft's ability to stay in the air. At the moment we're not finding that, we're just slowing down, we're getting a bit more sluggish, and we're going to burn more fuel. So the next thing we want to do is have a look at what can we do about this structural icing. Let's just set us up, let's go somewhere. We'll go to Apple Valley, that's out of the LA basin into the desert. We should just go there on the GPS, it's 27 miles away. So we'll put us back on autopilot, we'll go on to nav. We might have to climb a little bit more. We should really go through the pass, the Cajon Pass, up the road, but we're going to clear the mountains and we're going direct to Apple Valley. So what can we do? Well, structural icing, we've got a number of options. On the wings and on the tailplane we've got things called de-icing boots. These are rubberized devices that can expand and contract when we pump hot air into them. And the hot air comes from the bleed air system. You see, if I turn off the bleed air, we get a pneumatic low pressure warning there. So if I turn them on, there's bleed air tapped off the left engine and the right engine. So if we turn those on, we've got bleed air available to operate the de-icing boots. We've got various controls for operating the boots. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just bring that display back up. Hopefully you can see that. The very simplest thing we can do is we can switch the de-icer boots. We've got manual control or auto control. In fact, if I go to manual, we've got slow and fast. Put it to fast, and then we can basically blip the de-icing boots individually using a manual switch. So we've got a boot on the wings, at the outer end, and the wings at the inner end. Hang on, I'm just about over talking my engines there. And on the tailplane we've got the stabilizer, it says here we've got left and right. So if I pulse the wing inner boots manually, you should see we went from 100 to 98, 97, 96, 95. If I hold that down, nothing happens, so it does just pulse it. Same with the left stabilizer, right stabilizer. Now actually the distinction between left and right stabilizer, wing inner and outer, it's a meaningless distinction. You know, it's a detail that appears to be simulated. The detail of that isn't really simulated. It's just, you know, any one of those controls removes ice from the net structural ice that we've accumulated. Now, because that's on manual, when I'm not touching the switches, no de-icing is happening. The boots are uninflated and the ice is continuing to accumulate. Now it would continue to accumulate, but because I've been going up, I've actually come out of the top of the icing layer because we've climbed so far up, if we look at the outside air temperature, we've now gone down to minus 10, 12, maybe minus 18, maybe minus 17 degrees Celsius. That's actually too cold for icing. So we're no longer accumulating ice. Well, let's descend. That's what we'll do. We'll go back down. We're 16 miles from Apple Valley. Apple Valley's at about 3,000 feet, so we're still 7,000 feet too high. And as we descend back to a point where the temperature's below minus 10, sorry, above minus 10, we should begin to accumulate ice again. As we're doing that, let's just talk about the other options we've got for de-icing. So we're still at 84%. That was manual. If we switch to auto, what we're going to see is the ice will go down. It's going down rapidly, 83.6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 82.9. If we switch the de-icer boot operation to slow, it will still go down automatically. 6.5, 0.4, 0.3, 0.2, 0.1, 81, 80.9, and so on. I've turned it off completely now, so we're not de-icing. Now that slow fast switch, okay, we're sorry, just to butt in, we're now accumulating ice again, which suggests the temperature's risen. Yeah, so we're at minus 8 or 9 degrees there. As I was saying, that distinction between putting the boots on fast or slow, it has an effect, but I don't know any penalty for using fast. Presumably in the real world there's a benefit or a cost to using either fast or slow. You know, you might presume that shedding the ice too quickly, if there's a high ice load, you might get big chunks of ice hitting the fuselage or something like that, and so, you know, a gradual de-icing might be better. But again, in the simulator, you know, no reason I can see not to leave it on fast. So for now, that's it for structural icing. And I say for now because we are going to come back to structural icing later, and we're going to see some things we can do to make it more realistic and more of a challenge to fly the aircraft in icing conditions. Okay, we're at Apple Valley, we're on the ground, and we've had a quick sandwich, and it's time to hit the road again. So I'm just going to head us out to the runway. This scenery, by the way, is looking a bit tacky. We're using Orbic's FTX Global base for textures, Global Vector, and we're using the Pilot's FS10 Global Mesh. So you see that there's some mesh, you know, anomalies going on here. I've not done any tweaking of this setup yet. There are some things you can do where you have mesh anomalies, so I'll sort this out eventually. And of course this is a default air port on top of the FTX Global and the Pilot's Mesh. And actually I've been to Apple Valley. I've flown into Apple Valley in a Cessna 172 and it doesn't look anything like this. So what do we need to be doing now? Well, we've had a look at all the effects of structural icing and the things we can do to counteract that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at engine problems. There's a whole bunch of things that can happen to take out our engines associated with icing. So we're going to go out and talk about those. Let me just get up in the air first, and then we can talk more. We've still got that boatload of structural icing. I've got the de-icing boots active on auto now, so that should be clearing. We'll have a look at that in just a second. We're going to see how difficult it is to get us through the takeoff. Don't forget we're at 3,000 feet already. We easily managed to lift off there under 10 degrees of flaps. We'll just have a quick peek at that. We've still got 50% icing on, but it's not hampering us especially. what we'll do is we're just going to set up a trip. We'll go back over the mountains into the LA Basin. We'll go to probably Ontario. That should take us roughly through the pass. There's Ontario. Direct to 36 miles. Now I should say that I'm not doing any of this by the book at the moment. There is a placard in the aircraft. I do have it on my, it's the one on the yoke. I do have it on a panel here, but this placard on the yoke talks about use of flaps in icing conditions. I'm not really following what it says on that for now. We're just going to leave things going. The engines are not protected at the moment. We've got pitot heat on and we've got windshield heat on. That's all we have. And in terms of airframe icing, we've got the auto de-ice boots on. So what we're going to do is we're just going to talk about the engines. It's maybe best to describe the engine failures in terms of the protection measures that the Twin Otter gives us to guard against them. And we've got basically 3 different protections against engine icing. We've got an intake heater, which you find on the panel, intake anti-ice it's called. We've also got a thing called an inertial separator, which is for what happens with the inertial separator is it opens a duct that diverts the air round pretty much a 90-degree bend in the intake system, and what that does is any large particles of ice actually don't make it around the bend and they go out an exit door somewhere else in the engine structure. So that's a protection against ingesting large chunks of ice. So don't forget this is a turbine engine. We've got a gas generator turbine which has got a very high speed component rotating at something like, I don't know what it is, 20,000 RPM or something. We don't want chunks of ice impacting the turbine blades, otherwise we're going to get a catastrophe. And those are the main protective measures. I'll talk about the other thing in a while. Now just out of interest, we're flying here, we're in the high desert of California. This is the ground elevation here is about 3,000 feet. We're going to fly over these 8,500 foot mountains into the Los Angeles Basin, and we're going to do it through we're going to follow a road which is coming off over there through a gap in the hills called the Cajon Pass. And in fact I need to switch on to heading mode and steer us over in that direction. This scenery, by the way, this is pretty, although we've got the Orbix FTX global stuff in, don't forget we're using the default land class. So once you get into the desert here, the land class is pretty inconsistent and undetailed. And this doesn't look too bad, this looks natural-ish. And the desert is pretty Spartan out here, but you will come across some very unrealistic looking, football pitch shaped forests and stuff like that. So we can look forward to when Orbix releases its North America open land class, which will definitely be getting a copy of that. Now, just talking about engine failures, there is a random element to how the engine failures happen, but it is fairly likely to happen. I've had this when I was setting up for the previous part of this video, looking at the airframe icing. I kept having to redo parts of it because my engines were failing. So what I'm hoping is as we go along here and we talk, we may experience that. Now, as we did with the airframe icing, we can use the engine anti-ice controls preemptively, so we can put them on to guard against the possibility of engine flame out due to ice ingestion. And with the standard Twin Otter extended, there's no reason not to do that. Now, I've made us in the setup of my cockpit, I've departed from that slightly. And so for example, if I go and just illustrate that if I switch on, in fact let's do this methodically. If I find the panel, the overhead panel, which has got the de-icing switches on, so they're the de-icing switches, and you can't see obviously the main panel here while I'm doing this, so I'm going to turn the sound up. I'm going to switch on the intake anti-ice, which is the switch here. I'm going to flip it with the mouse. I don't usually do this, and if you listen to the engine note when I do that, nothing happened, no change. Switch it off, switch it on, switch it off. Now the point I'm making there is, in the standard Twin Otter extended, when you switch on the intake heaters as an anti-ice or as an anti-ice measure, there's no penalty for doing that, so there's no reason not to do that. In my cockpit, if I do the same experiment, if you listen to the engine note again, if I flip on the intake anti-ice, there's a change in the engine note. What you might have seen is the torque gauges went down significantly by about 15%, in fact. If I flip that back out, that's restored. Now just before I talk about that, I'm going to turn us towards, let's see, we'll turn us towards banning. I don't know what the code for banning is, and hopefully it's something K-ban or something like that. KBNG, that's got to be it. That's and it's 30 miles, that seems about right. So we'll go direct to banning municipal, puts onto nav. So, back to the plot. When I engage intake anti-ice, we get a reduction in the torque, which you can see on the gauges and here in the engine note, and it comes back when I switch anti-ice off. What's the difference? Well, by default, behind the scenes, if you look at what's going on, the Twin Otter extended, when you put on the intake anti-ice, or indeed the intake deflector, which is the inertial separator, that doesn't activate the default FSX engine anti-ice, which, as you might recall from my earlier discussion, is the same as effectively the carburettor heats if we were flying a piston engine aircraft. And I think that's wrong, because if you do a bit of research, you will find some accounts of, again, just remembering that every turboprop engine is set up differently. You'll find PT6 engines of all variants set up differently and with different control systems in different aircraft. So with that in mind, there are some accounts out there of engine anti-ice measures that cause a significant loss of torque. Again, the account that I'm thinking of in particular noted a 14% or 15% drop in torque associated with the inertial separator. So I think it's a fair addition to the simulation to switch on the engine anti-ice, FSX control, and take the performance hit whenever we switch on the intake anti-ice or the inertial separator. So that's what I've done. Makes it more challenging to fly because there's a penalty. You've got to decide whether to use these as a preemptive measure, and there'll be some circumstances if you're flying close to the limits of your weight, or if you're carrying a heavy ice load that you haven't managed to shed yet, that's a trade-off that's essential. You might not have enough power to do what you need to do if you turn on these systems. So anyway, I've gone into that at great length. Very simple idea. So I'll just demonstrate that again. I mean, that was the intake anti-ice. In fact, if I show you the inertial separator, you may or may not be able to see this, but on the panel there's no visual indication other than the drop in torque that the intake heater is on. But the inertial separator, you have to hold I mean, this is realistic in the sense that how this works is when you switch it on, it actually swivels a duct, so something has got to move into position or out of position, and it takes a while. So there's a switch to extend it. You hold it down and you watch these little indicators on the dash, and when they come around to foot to ext, they're fully extended, and then we get that drop in the torque that I've just spoken about. Now that drop in torque is abrupt, and of course in real life it probably wouldn't be quite that abrupt. That's nitpicking really. So again, we're taking a hit when either that, we don't take a double hit. If I put the intake anti-ice on as well, we don't get another collateral drop in torque. In fact, that's probably would be more realistic if we did, because they're two separate effects on the flow of air into the engine. So if we turn that off, if we retract the, in fact, tell you what I'll do, I'm going to open that inertial separator again. You might wonder why, in terms of simulation, we've got two different engine anti-ice measures that seem to do the same job. Well, there's an issue here, which is one of these is electrical, one of them is pneumatically operated. The thing that swivels the duct for the inertial separator is actually controlled by bleed air. If I turn off the bleed air and I try and retract it, watch the indicators here, nothing's happening. So we're not able to retract that if we have no bleed air. Now of course we just put the bleed air switches on and we can retract it without a problem. But don't forget that we're talking here about engine ice protection measures. If we don't have these measures on and we lose both engines, we're not going to be able to extend the inertial separator because we don't have bleed air available. And in that situation the only option is to use the intake anti-ice heater. So I'm thinking maybe we can just demonstrate some of that. In fact, let's set this up methodically. If I switch off the left engine's bleed air, so we're only taking bleed air from the right engine, and if I fail the right hand engine just by taking the fuel, so we've lost the engine there, so we've lost the bleed air as well, which means if I try and extend the inertial separator, holding the switch down, looking up here, it's not happening. So if we continue with this theme of simulating an engine failure due to ice ingestion, let's just go through that again and see what we need to do in response to that. So imagine we're cruising along and we've got, we're not bothered at the moment about airframe icing, but we've got no engine anti-ice measures in place and we lose an engine. So we take the right hand engine out. Now I'm leaving the fuel on because if we fail this engine due to ingestion of ice, the fuel would still be on. So we've still got fuel flowing through the engine, we've still got the fuel pump on. We put the props to fully fine. You'll notice we've still got 100% RPM on the propeller. It's still windmilling in the airflow. First thing we need to do is we need to clear the ice. Now we've got the other engine running and so we have bleed air. We might choose to extend the inertial separator. That takes time. So we probably put on the intake de-ice heater. Obviously if we'd lost both engines at the same time, the only option we've got is the heater. Then we can get that engine to restart by simply going to the ignition, switching the ignition to manual or continuous. So that's giving us a continuous spark and you'll see the engine's relit. Once the engine's up and running again, we can turn that ignition off. We no longer need a source of ignition, it's self-sustaining. So that torque's come back up and we should be able to continue on our way. Now I'm noticing at the moment that torque on that engine seems to have stabilised at a much higher setting than the other engine. Not sure why that is. I've noticed this before, that when you bring an engine back from having failed in the manner I've just done it, that sometimes this the recovered engine settles at a higher torque. Sometimes it does that and sometimes it then comes down and stabilises. I don't know what's happening there, but there's some glitch in when you restart that engine. There's some glitch about where the torque stabilises when it comes back. I think it's probably not reading the power lever setting correctly when you restart the engine. So you have to do some excursion with the power lever. But we're back to normal here. Intake anti-ice is on. Again, we see the effect when we turn that back off. So that pretty much covers all the features of the Twin Otter Extended in terms of icing and the things that can happen to us as a consequence of icing and the facilities that are provided for dealing with the consequences of icing. And you're probably thinking it's all very interesting, but it's a little bit lacking in some ways, particularly the airframe anti-icing. So what we're going to do is have a look at something else we can do to improve that. I'm just going to take us back to Palm Springs and we'll get on the ground there and we'll have a bit of a talk about that.